He was a king forged in titanium and starlight, a man who had built a celestial empire. Arthur Vance, at 72, had spent a lifetime launching America's eyes and ears into the silent dark. His company, Vance Aeronautics, the bedrock of the nation's satellite infrastructure. Yet now, his kingdom, built on precision and reliability, was facing a silent, insidious rebellion. His magnum opus, the Ariadne satellite constellation, a revolutionary global positioning system poised to redefine everything from military navigation to autonomous farming, was failing. A ghost was haunting the system, a phantom signal drift that would appear without warning, sending meticulously calculated positions spiraling into chaos. His legion of PhD-holding engineers, the finest minds money could buy, were like medieval astronomers trying to explain a supernova. They were humbled, baffled, and powerless. Fleeing the sterile, panic-filled atmosphere of his mission control center, Arthur sought refuge in the terrestrial world, in the quiet, wood-paneled anonymity of a steakhouse he hadn't visited in 30 years. He needed a moment of analog peace in a world crumbling under digital failure. But as he sat nursing a bourbon older than most of his employees, a flicker of movement from the kitchen service window caught his eye. It wasn't the clang of steel or the hiss of the grill. It was a waitress, young and weary-looking, hunched in a corner during a lull. She wasn't scrolling on her phone. On a small, battered laptop, a vibrant, complex waterfall of color cascaded down the screen. A spectrogram, a visual map of radio waves. And nestled in the chaotic static was a faint, impossibly familiar sine wave. It was the ghost. She wasn't just looking at data. She was listening to the whispers of the universe on a $20 antenna. In that heart-stopping moment, Arthur Vance realized the answer to his billion-dollar crisis might not be found in a clean room at Cape Canaveral, but in the tired eyes of the young woman who was about to ask him if he wanted a refill. The Pasadena twilight, usually a comforting blanket of rose and gold over the San Gabriel Mountains, did nothing to soothe the glacial fury in Arthur Vance's chest. From his sprawling office, which overlooked the historic Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the view was a testament to his life's work, a landscape of scientific ambition. Tonight, it felt like a monument to his impending, colossal failure. On the vast, wall-mounted display that usually showed orbital trajectories, a single damning graphic was frozen in place. A map of North America with a bright red circle, 100 miles in diameter, centered over Kansas. Inside that circle, every simulated asset relying on the Ariadne network, drones, cargo ships, military convoys, had gone haywire. Terminal Drift Event 7, the report read. It was the 7th catastrophic failure in 3 weeks. Ariadne was supposed to be his legacy, not just another GPS, but a system so precise it could guide a surgical laser from orbit. The Department of Defense had staked the future of their autonomous systems on it, a contract worth more than the GDP of a small nation. Now that contract was hanging by a thread, held by the frayed patience of a 4-star general who had given him a final, non-negotiable deadline, 48 hours to identify the source of the drift, or Vance Aeronautics would face a breach of contract that would make the company's stock price a historical footnote. His lead engineer, Dr. Marcus Thorne, a man with degrees from MIT and a condescending smirk he probably acquired at the same institution, had just concluded another fruitless 8-hour briefing. Thorne and his team spoke in a hermetically sealed language of quantum jitter, algorithmic decay, and stochastic resonance. They were brilliant men, chasing digital phantoms within the code, convinced the error was a software flaw of unimaginable complexity. They had run trillions of simulations, rewritten entire modules, and were now proposing a brute force predictive filter that was, in essence, an educated guess, a multi-million-dollar band-aid for a wound they couldn't find. "The anomaly is non-deterministic, Arthur," Thorne had said, his tone suggesting Arthur's age precluded him from understanding such arcane concepts. "It's a ghost in the machine." "Find the ghost, Marcus," Arthur had growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder, "or I'll find a new exorcist." Now, alone in the echoing silence of his office, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He was Arthur Vance, the man who had started with a single surplus radio antenna in his garage after returning from Vietnam. He understood machines, understood the clean logic of physics and engineering. This felt different. This was chaos, a malevolent randomness that mocked the very order he had built his life upon. He felt a helplessness he hadn't known since he was a boy, tinkering with his father's shortwave radio, trying to pull a clear voice from a sea of static. He needed to escape. He bypassed his driver, taking an old Lincoln from his personal collection, a car with real steel and no GPS. He drove without a destination, the city lights blurring past. He found himself in a quiet, older part of town, and on a whim, pulled up to the observatory grill. It was a relic, a place of dark wood, leather booths, and waiters in starched white jackets. It smelled of seared steak and old money. It was the antithesis of his life, of sterile labs and humming servers. The hostess led him to a secluded booth in the back, a small bubble of tranquility. He ordered a steak, medium rare, and a double bourbon, neat. As the liquor burned a welcome trail down his throat, he watched the staff. They moved with an unhurried, practiced rhythm, a complex system that worked flawlessly. His gaze settled on one waitress. She was younger than the others, perhaps 22 or 23. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, severe ponytail, and she moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed at odds with the deep weariness in her eyes. There was an intelligence there, a focused intensity as she scanned her tables, anticipating needs before they were voiced. Her name tag, pinned slightly crooked on her black apron, read Clara. She had an aura of contained thought, as if the physical act of serving was a simple subroutine, running while her main processor was busy on a far more complex problem. He was halfway through his steak when he saw her slip through a swinging door, marked Staff Only. He didn't think much of it until he realized 10, then 15 minutes had passed. The other staff bustled in and out, but she didn't reappear. A flicker of curiosity, a welcome distraction sparked within him. The men's room was down a short corridor, past that same staff entrance. As he walked by, the door swung open as a busboy emerged with a tray of glasses. Arthur glanced inside. The kitchen was a cacophony of steam, sizzling pans and shouted orders, but his eyes were drawn to a small, cramped alcove behind a rack of cooling pies. There sat Clara. She wasn't on a smoke break or texting her friends. She was hunched over a thick, battle-scarred laptop, a pair of oversized headphones covering her ears. Plugged into the laptop was a small, strange-looking device, a software-defined radio receiver, connected by a thin wire to a cheap telescopic antenna propped up in the grime-streaked window. On her screen was not code, but a living, breathing waterfall of radio frequencies, a spectrogram. Her fingers weren't typing. They were manipulating the display, zooming in, applying filters, her movements swift and precise. He had seen displays like that 1,000 times in his own labs. It was the raw language of the universe, the noise from which all signals are born. And then he saw it. In a narrow band of the spectrum, almost completely buried in the background noise of the city, was a faint, undulating signal, a carrier wave that drifted, ever so slightly, in frequency. It was a visual match for the telemetry data from Ariadne Event 7. His breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The clatter of the kitchen faded to a distant roar. A waitress, in the back of a steakhouse, using what looked like hobbyist equipment, was looking at the very ghost that was threatening to tear his empire apart. It was impossible. It was ludicrous. And it was happening. He forgot the men's room. He forgot his half-eaten steak. He forgot everything but the young woman in the kitchen who was sifting through cosmic static like a prospector, panning for gold. For a full minute, Arthur Vance stood rooted in the hallway, a statue of stunned disbelief. His mind, a fortress of logic and empirical data, was under siege. Every rational instinct screamed coincidence. A stray signal from a local TV tower, an anomaly from a ham radio operator. She was just a hobbyist, indulging a peculiar passion on her break. But the shape of that wave, the subtle, sickening way it drifted, it was imprinted on his brain from staring at it for weeks. He drew a deep, steadying breath, the air thick with the scent of garlic bread and industrial dish soap. Desperation was a powerful acid, capable of dissolving even the most rigid certainties. What was the alternative? Return to his office and listen to Thorne propose another billion-dollar guess? He had nothing to lose but a sliver of his pride, and that had been chipped away to almost nothing over the past month. He pushed the swinging door open and stepped into the kitchen. The sudden blast of heat and noise was a physical shock. "Hey, staff only, pal," a line cook yelled. Not even looking up from a row of sizzling steaks, Arthur ignored him. His eyes were locked on Clara. She hadn't noticed him, her concentration absolute. Her brow was furrowed, her lower lip caught between her teeth, a study in pure focus. He navigated the chaotic floor, stepping around a bin of potato peels, and approached her corner. "Excuse me," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. Clara's head snapped up. Her eyes, wide and startled, darted from his expensive suit to his face. A flicker of professional panic crossed her features. She instantly slammed the laptop shut, the metallic click echoing in the small space. "Sir, you can't be back here. Is everything all right with your meal?" The waitress persona was back, a shield of rote politeness. "My meal is fine," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the closed laptop. "The problem is with a non-periodic frequency drift in a car-band uplink carrier wave." The effect of his words was immediate and profound. The polite mask didn't just crack, it vaporized. Clara's jaw went slack. The color drained from her face. Her eyes, which he'd previously noted as intelligent, now looked sharp, analytical, and deeply suspicious. She didn't feign ignorance. She knew exactly what he was talking about. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a tense whisper. "My name is Arthur Vance." He watched for the spark of recognition, and he saw it. A subtle widening of her eyes, a sharp intake of breath. Anyone interested in satellites knew the name. She looked from his tailored suit to his weathered face, the pieces clicking into place in her brilliant mind. "Vance Aeronautics," she breathed. "Ariadne." It wasn't a question, it was a diagnosis. "You've heard of the problem," Arthur stated, the last vestiges of his skepticism dissolving into the humid air. "It's hard to miss," she admitted, her voice low and guarded. "The telemetry data is public, if you know where to look. The whole radio astronomy community is buzzing about it. Everyone's got a theory." She clutched the edge of her laptop as if it were a shield. "You're in serious trouble. The DoD contract will be the least of my worries when my company becomes insolvent," he said, laying his cards on the table. There was no point in pretense. "What were you looking at just now?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the head chef, who was now watching their exchange with open-mouthed curiosity. A personal project. I track atmospheric phenomena. Don't lie to me, Clara, he said, his voice soft but laced with an intensity that made her flinch. I saw the spectrogram. That wasn't atmospheric scattering. It had the signature of a phase-locked loop trying to correct. I saw the drift. Was that a live signal? She swallowed hard, her knuckles white on her laptop case. No, she admitted quietly. It was a recording from the last event. I pulled the raw IQ data from a public monitoring station in Colorado. I want you to come to my facility. I want you to look at our data, all of it. The words felt reckless, insane, but he said them anyway. She stared at him as if he'd sprouted a second head. What? Sir, I'm a waitress. 5 minutes ago, you were a radio astronomer, he countered. Which one is the real you? I'll pay you. A consulting fee. More money than you make here in a decade. Sign any non-disclosure agreement my lawyers can draft. Just look. Clara's mind was clearly a battlefield. Fear, disbelief, and a flicker of something else, a deep academic hunger, warred in her expression. Why would you ask me? You have hundreds of engineers with doctorates. My hundreds of engineers are digital natives. They've been staring at their own code for so long they can't see the world it operates in, Arthur said, the frustration evident in his voice. They're looking for a bug in the software, a ghost in the machine. You were looking at the static. You were looking at the universe. You're not trapped in their box. At this point, I'd rather trust a fresh pair of eyes than another PhD with a theory. He saw the conflict in her. This was an impossible opportunity, handed to her by a living legend in a greasy kitchen. But the risk of failure, of being laughed out of a world-class laboratory, was terrifying. I can't, she stammered, shaking her head. I don't have a degree. I was at Caltech, studying astrophysics, but I had to drop out. My grandfather got sick. I take care of him. I just do this, to stay sane, to keep from forgetting everything. The confession hung in the air, thick with lost potential. Caltech. She hadn't just been a hobbyist. She'd been on the path. Life had thrown a roadblock in her way. This information didn't deter Arthur. It galvanized him. This wasn't a random fluke. This was a thoroughbred genius who had been put out to pasture by circumstance. I don't give a damn about your degree, Clara, he said, his voice firm. A degree is a receipt that says you paid for an education. What I saw on that screen tells me you have one. The Ariadne satellites are perfect. The software is flawless. But something out there, something in the environment, is interfering with the signal before it ever reaches our ground stations. My team is looking for a typo in the book. I think they need to be looking at the weather. Does that sound like a problem you'd find interesting? He watched as he spoke, detailing the core of his heterodox theory. Her expression shifted. The fear receded, replaced by the intensely focused, analytical look he'd seen when she was at her laptop. She was no longer a waitress. She was a scientist considering a hypothesis. The drift is non-periodic, but it's not random, she murmured, almost to herself. It correlates with spikes in solar proton flux, but not consistently. It's like something is lensing the signal, a temporary atmospheric duct. Her insight was immediate, a theory so far outside his team's software-centric thinking that it was breathtakingly fresh. They had dismissed solar weather as background noise to be filtered out. She saw it as a potential cause. Arthur pulled a heavy black business card from his wallet. Vance Aeronautics, Pasadena. Be there tomorrow. 9 a.m. Ask for me. I'll handle security. He placed the card on top of her closed laptop. Name your price, Clara. Whatever it is, I'll pay it. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the card. The simple black rectangle with the silver Vance Aeronautics logo was a key to a locked kingdom. "Sir, your check," she started, the habit of her job a stubborn reflex. "Forget the check," Arthur said, turning to leave. He paused at the door and looked back. She was staring at the card, her eyes wide with a terrifying, brilliant hope. 9 a.m., Clara. Don't let me down." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving the chaos behind. He felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't experienced in decades. It was the most illogical, unscientific, and desperate gamble of his entire career. It was either the move that would save his legacy or the final spectacular folly of a dying king. As he stepped back into the hushed calm of the restaurant, he had absolutely no idea which. The next morning, the main lobby of Vance Aeronautics was a temple to the gods of engineering and ambition. A full-scale model of the Ares-5 rocket hung suspended from the 4-story ceiling, its polished titanium skin gleaming under recessed spotlights. The walls were glass, the floors were white marble, and the air itself seemed to hum with quiet, relentless purpose. It was designed to intimidate, to project a sense of cosmic importance. To Clara, clutching the strap of her worn canvas messenger bag, it felt like the antechamber to an inquisition. She had spent a sleepless night, her mind a whirlwind of terror and exhilarating possibility. She'd devoured every scrap of public data on the Ariadne drift, her brain alight with theories, each more audacious than the last. She wore the only professional outfit she owned, a simple dark grey blouse and black slacks, which felt as inadequate as a paper shield in this arena of tailored suits and bespoke confidence. "I'm here to see Arthur Vance," she told the receptionist, her voice a small, tight thing. "My name is Clara Evans." The receptionist, a woman with an unnervingly perfect smile, typed her name into the system. Her eyebrows shot up. "Of course, Miss Evans. Mr. Vance is expecting you. 50th floor, executive suite." She gestured to a private elevator that slid open with a silent, deferential hiss. The ride up was a stomach-lurching, silent ascent. When the doors opened, Arthur Vance was waiting. In his domain, he was a different man. The weary desperation of the previous night was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute command. "Clara, glad you came," he said with a curt nod. "No time to waste." He led her through a labyrinth of glass-walled offices and open-plan work areas where some of the brightest minds in the country were hunched over monitors displaying complex equations and 3D models. Heads turned. Whispers followed them. The sight of the company's patriarch personally escorting an unknown young woman in simple clothes was an anomaly of the highest order. Clara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her, dismissing her. The imposter syndrome was a physical weight on her shoulders. They entered a vast, circular conference room, known as the War Room. A dozen senior engineers were already assembled around a massive holographic display table, the air thick with tension and the smell of burnt coffee. This was the Ariadne Task Force. "Everyone, this is Clara Evans," Arthur announced, his voice leaving no room for debate. "Ms. Evans is a consultant with a unique expertise in signal propagation. She will be providing a fresh perspective on our current crisis. Give her whatever she needs. Full access to all raw telemetry, server logs, everything. She reports directly to me." A heavy, resentful silence descended. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. Clara's eyes were drawn to one man in particular, who stood at the head of the table. He was in his late 30s, with a sharp suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and a condescending smirk that seemed to be his default expression. A placard identified him as Dr. Marcus Thorne, lead project architect. Thorne leaned back, tapping a stylus against the table. "A consultant," he said, drawing the word out as if it tasted foul. He raked his gaze over Clara, from her sensible shoes to her worn bag. "May I ask which firm you're with, Ms. Evans? Or perhaps which university's radio astronomy department we've borrowed you from?" The question was a gauntlet thrown, a public challenge designed to humiliate her before she'd even spoken a word. The other engineers watched, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and schadenfreude. Before Clara could find her voice, Arthur cut in, his tone like chipped ice. "Her credentials are that she has my confidence, Marcus. That's all you need to know. Get her a terminal." The rebuke silenced Thorne, but his eyes smouldered with a cold, intellectual fury. He gestured dismissively to a junior engineer. "Kevin, find Ms. Evans a workstation, a guest account." The implication was clear. She was temporary, an outsider. Kevin, a nervous young man with dark circles under his eyes, led Clara to a small, isolated desk at the far end of the main development floor. As he furiously typed to set up her access, he spoke in a hushed whisper. "Don't mind Dr. Thorne. He's proprietary about this project. He designed the core software." "And the core software is what everyone thinks is broken," Clara replied quietly, her eyes already scanning the system architecture diagrams on a nearby wall. The moment she logged in, the world fell away. The whispers, the intimidating environment, the palpable resentment of Marcus Thorne, it all dissolved into background noise. Before her, on a bank of 3 high-resolution monitors, was the raw, beating heart of the Ariadne network. It was a universe of data, a fire hose of information from satellites, ground stations, and deep space monitoring arrays. She spent the first several hours not looking at code, but at the signals themselves. She ignored the filtered, processed data the engineering team worked with and dove straight into the raw, unfiltered telemetry, the noise they so carefully scrubbed away. It was, to her, not noise at all. It was a symphony of cosmic information. She cross-referenced the precise moments of the drift events with solar observatory logs, ionospheric charts, and even data from amateur radio enthusiasts who tracked atmospheric conditions. By midday, she found a pattern, a ghost hiding in plain sight. Each of the 7 drift events had been preceded by a very specific and rare type of solar event, a coronal mass ejection aimed not directly at Earth, but at a tangent, creating a highly energized proton stream that would skim the magnetosphere. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle. She needed to see the hardware specs for the satellite receivers, specifically the shielding on the primary signal amplifiers. She found Kevin. "I need the procurement and hardware specification documents for the Ariadne B satellite block," she said. Kevin paled. That's highly classified. Only level 5 clearance. Dr. Thorne and Mr. Vance are the only ones on this floor." Clara found Thorne in his glass-walled office, pontificating to 2 senior engineers. He saw her approach and deliberately made her wait, holding up a hand while he finished an elaborate explanation on a whiteboard. When he finally acknowledged her, it was with an air of profound irritation. "Yes?" "Dr. Thorne, I need to see the hardware specs for the satellite receivers, specifically the radiation shielding protocols." He scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Absolutely not. We don't give guest consultants access to proprietary hardware designs. The problem, Ms. Evans, is in the software. The physics of the hardware is a solved problem." "I don't think it is," she said, her voice even but firm. "I think you have an environmental susceptibility. The drift events correlate with tangential proton flux events. I need to see if the shielding is rated for that specific type of anisotropic radiation." Thorne's condescending smirk tightened into a sneer. Anisotropic radiation. Miss Evans, my team consists of the world's foremost experts in signal processing. We have modeled every conceivable type of interference. I assure you, if the problem was as simple as a solar flare, we would have found it in the first hour, not 3 weeks. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do. He turned his back on her. It was a dead end. He was stonewalling her. But it was his defensiveness, his utter refusal to even consider a hardware or environmental cause that solidified her suspicion. It wasn't just ego. It was something else. He was protecting something. Frustrated, Clara returned to her desk. If he wouldn't give her the specs, she would have to prove her theory another way. She couldn't see the guts of the satellite, but she could build a model of it. She began to write a complex simulation, not of the software, but of the physics. She modeled the K-band radio waves, the Earth's atmosphere and magnetosphere, and the Sun. She started plugging in the data from the proton events, and then she began to model the receiver itself, working backward. She started with the assumption of perfect shielding and worked her way down, testing different alloys, different thicknesses. It was a monumental task. She worked through the night, long after the rest of the team had gone home. Only Arthur Vance remained, a silent sentinel in his 50th floor office, watching her. A grim determination settled over Clara. Thorne saw her as a nuisance. The team saw her as the CEO's strange pet project. But she knew she was close. The ghost in the machine wasn't a ghost at all. It was a monster, born of sunlight and hiding in a floor of metal, not code. And she was the only one hunting it in the right forest. The next 36 hours became a blur of caffeine, complex physics, and sheer, stubborn will. Clara's small desk was an island of controlled chaos in the vast, quiet office, littered with scribbled equations, half-empty coffee mugs, and printouts of solar wind charts. Arthur, true to his word, left her alone, but he ensured a steady stream of food and coffee appeared at her desk, silent offerings of support. Her simulation was her laboratory. She ran it hundreds of times, tweaking variables, adjusting the model. Thorne and his team would occasionally walk by, casting skeptical glances at her screens, which displayed not lines of code, but swirling, colorful models of particle physics. They saw it as abstract, academic nonsense, irrelevant to the real work of debugging software. They couldn't have been more wrong. Late on the second night, with the DoD's deadline less than 12 hours away, she found it. The simulation finally clicked into place, the result so clean, so perfect it sent a shiver down her spine. The problem wasn't the shielding in general, it was a specific component, the low-noise amplifier, the very first part of the receiver to touch the incoming signal. To save money, a paltry sum of a few $1,000s per satellite in a multi-billion-dollar project, a cheaper, slightly less robust amplifier had been chosen. It performed perfectly under all standard tests and all expected forms of solar radiation, but it had one tiny, undocumented vulnerability. When struck by a high-energy proton at a specific oblique angle, the exact kind of particle stream produced by the tangential coronal mass ejections she had identified, the amplifier's gallium arsenide substrate would become momentarily excited. It wouldn't fail. It would simply, for a few milliseconds, introduce a minute, almost undetectable phase shift in the signal it was amplifying. This phase shift was the ghost. The satellite's own software, trying to maintain its phase-locked loop, would interpret this tiny shift as a positional error and try to correct for it. But since the interference was fleeting, the correction would be wrong, sending the system into a brief, chaotic oscillation before it restabilized. It was a one-in-a-million confluence of a specific solar event, a specific angle of attack, and a specific, substandard piece of hardware. A wave of dizzying euphoria washed over her. She had found it. The fix was twofold. The long-term solution was to replace the amplifiers in future satellite blocks, but the immediate fix was software, a patch that could recognize the unique signature of the proton interference, a specific pattern in the signal's noise floor, and instruct the navigation software to momentarily ignore the amplifier's input, coasting on the last valid data for the few seconds the event lasted. It was an elegant, beautiful solution. Her first instinct was to run to Arthur's office, but she stopped herself. She needed irrefutable proof. She ran the simulation one last time, this time programming her proposed software patch into the virtual system. She subjected it to the exact proton flux from Ariadne Event 7. The drift was gone. The system held perfectly steady. It was the smoking gun. She compiled everything, her research on the solar events, the simulation data, the specific part number of the faulty amplifier, and the code for the software patch, into a single, secure file on the network drive. She named the folder Ariadne Root Cause Analysis, CE. Her initials? A small, defiant act of ownership. It was 4:15 a.m. She sent a simple, one-line email to Arthur's private address. "I found the ghost. It's made of metal." Then, utterly spent, she slumped back in her chair, intending to rest her eyes for just a moment. But she had not been working in a vacuum. Marcus Thorne, consumed by professional jealousy, and a growing dread, had been watching her. He couldn't stomach the idea of this dropout, this waitress, succeeding where he and his elite team had failed. From his office, he had access to network monitoring tools. He had seen her pulling solar data, running physics simulations. He dismissed it as amateur hour. But then, around 3 a.m., he'd noticed the sheer volume of processing power her simulation was consuming. Curious, he used his administrative privileges to take a remote peek at her desktop. What he saw made his blood run cold. He saw her physics models, the vulnerability analysis of the amplifier, the damning conclusion. He realized with sickening certainty that she was right. And worse, he realized why she was right. He remembered the meeting, nearly 2 years ago, where he had personally signed off on that specific, cheaper amplifier, overriding a junior engineer's recommendation for a more robust, military-spec version. He had done it to bring his part of the project in under budget, earning him a hefty bonus. Panic gave way to a cold, predatory cunning. She had found the solution, but she was an outsider, a nobody with no credibility. He, on the other hand, was the project lead. It was his word against hers. Working with a feverish intensity, he replicated her findings. It was simple now that he knew exactly where to look. He copied her software patch, making a few cosmetic changes to the variable names so it wouldn't be an exact duplicate. He wrote his own report, carefully rephrasing her conclusions, framing the discovery as the result of a deep-level hardware-software interface analysis that he had been leading all along. He presented the faulty amplifier not as a cost-cutting error, but as a component whose subtle vulnerabilities only became apparent under our new, advanced simulation paradigms. He created a new folder, saved his own version of the solution, and then, with a final act of malicious data sanitation, he used his top-level privileges to access the server. He found her folder, Ariadne Root Cause Analysis, CE, and permanently deleted it. He then wiped the server logs that would show his access and deletion. Her proof, her entire 36 hours of work, had vanished into the ether. At 7 a.m., just as Clara was stirring in her chair, stiff and groggy, Marcus Thorne sent a company-wide email to Arthur Vance and the entire executive board. Subject: urgent breakthrough. Ariadne stability issue solved. The email began. Team, after a final intensive deep dive session, which I led through the night, we have successfully identified and resolved the root cause of the Ariadne signal drift. The issue stems from a subtle hardware susceptibility to extreme space weather, which we have developed a software patch to mitigate. The solution is ready for immediate deployment. Full technical debrief at the 9 a.m. DoD briefing. He had stolen her discovery, her triumph, and twisted it into a shield for his own incompetence. The stage was set for his victory, and Clara Evans was about to walk onto it, completely unaware that her ghost had been captured by a demon. Clara walked into the 9 a.m. war room, feeling a strange mix of profound exhaustion and giddy anticipation. She clutched a tablet containing her presentation, ready to explain the elegant dance of physics and engineering that had led to her discovery. The single line of her email to Arthur was her anchor. He knew. The scene she entered was not one of tense expectation, but of jubilant relief. Marcus Thorne was at the center of a crowd of beaming engineers and backslapping executives. General Miller, the stern DoD liaison, was actually smiling, shaking Thorne's hand. Arthur Vance stood near the head of the table, his face a mask of profound relief, though his eyes, when they met Clara's, held a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. "A truly masterful piece of work, Doctor," General Miller was booming. "You've pulled the rabbit out of the hat." Thorne smiled, a practiced, humble expression that didn't reach his eyes. "It was a team effort, General. We simply had to pivot our diagnostic approach from a purely software-based analysis to a more holistic, environmental hardware interaction model. We found the vulnerability and patched it." Clara froze, the tablet in her hand suddenly feeling like a block of lead. Environmental hardware interaction model. He was using her exact framework, her discovery. A cold, nauseating dread washed over her. Arthur turned his attention to the room. "Marcus, walk us through the solution." With the confidence of a magician revealing a masterful trick, Thorne projected his presentation onto the holographic display. He showed the code for the patch, her code, cosmetically altered. He explained the concept of the amplifier's vulnerability to proton flux with the clarity of a man who had understood it for a full 4 hours, instead of 48. He presented it as the triumphant result of his team's relentless, round-the-clock innovation. Clara stood in stunned, invisible silence. He had stolen it all. Not just the answer, but the language, the logic, the very soul of her work. She looked at the faces of the other engineers. They were awash with relief and admiration for their leader. Why wouldn't they be? He was Dr. Thorne. She was the strange girl who had been playing with solar charts in the corner. "Excellent work, Marcus," Arthur said, and the words struck Clara like a physical blow. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Clara, thank you for your contribution. Your unique perspective was clearly a catalyst for the team's final push. Please see my assistant about your consulting fee. We will ensure it is very generous." A catalyst, a generous fee. He was dismissing her. He was giving her a pat on the head and a check for her troubles, while Thorne was being canonized. The injustice of it was a sharp, metallic taste in her mouth. She started, her voice trembling. "That's my work. The analysis, the simulation, the patch. It's all mine." Thorne let out a short, pitying chuckle. "Ms. Evans, I understand the pressure of the situation can be disorienting. You were a great help in exploring some tangential theories. But my team and I put in the final hours to synthesize the data and engineer the actual solution. The server logs and commit histories will bear that out." He was right. He had erased her. Her folder, her proof, was gone. "I found it last night, around 4 a.m., she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I ran a simulation proving that the LTEC 7 amplifier was the point of failure. I emailed Mr. Vance." "An email," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, I think this young woman is simply overwhelmed. We have professional diagnostic suites, terabytes of data. We don't base billion-dollar fixes on hobbyist simulations." All eyes were on Clara. She looked exactly like what Thorne was painting her as. A fraud, a delusional wannabe trying to steal a piece of the glory. She looked at Arthur, her eyes pleading. She saw the relief in his face, warring with a shadow of doubt. He remembered their conversation in the steakhouse, her immediate theory. He had her one-line email. But Thorne's story was so complete, so plausible, and backed by the full weight of his position. "The important thing is that the problem is solved," Arthur said, his voice a flat, neutral tone that cut her to the core. "We can deploy the patch and inform the president." The meeting concluded. Thorne was the hero. Clara was a footnote, a ghost at a celebration that should have been hers. Defeated, she turned and walked out of the war room, the sounds of their renewed planning and relief fading behind her. She hadn't just been robbed. She had been erased. But Arthur Vance hadn't built an aerospace empire by accepting the most convenient answer. He was a systems analyst to his bones, and that applied to people as much as to circuits. Clara's desperate plea, her specific mention of the LTEC 7 amplifier, Thorne's too smooth, too perfect explanation, and that cryptic 4 a.m. email, it all felt wrong. A system that suddenly works perfectly after weeks of catastrophic failure is a system that warrants suspicion. While the company celebrated, Arthur returned to his office and closed the door. He didn't call his head of security or IT. This was a deep dive he had to run himself. He opened a secure terminal with the highest level of system privilege, a command line interface that bypassed all the user-friendly graphics. He was still an engineer at heart. First, he searched for the email. "I found the ghost. It's made of metal." It was a clue, not proof. It told him she believed she'd found a hardware issue. Next, he initiated a search for the folder she had mentioned, Ariadne Root Cause Analysis, CE. As Thorne had predicted, it didn't exist. But Arthur knew that on his high-security servers, delete was not the same as destroy. Files were marked for overwrite, but the data often remained, like ghosts on the hard drive. He initiated a low-level, raw sector scan of the network drive, a painstaking process that would take time. While it ran, he examined the server access logs. He saw Thorne's official commit of the software patch at 7:05 a.m. Clean. Too clean. A man covering his tracks often sweeps the floor so hard he leaves marks from the broom. Arthur expanded his search, looking not just at file access, but at all administrative commands executed on that server partition in the last 24 hours. And then he found it. At 4:28 a.m., Dr. Marcus Thorne's administrator account had initiated a shred U command, a military-grade multipass data destruction command on a directory named Temp, Savens, Ariadne, RCA. Immediately following that, at 4:29 a.m., the same account had run a manual script to purge the command log records for the preceding 5 minutes. It was the digital equivalent of a murderer burning the body, the shovel, and the map to the burial site. But Thorne had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. He had purged the log of the deletion, but he hadn't and couldn't purge the higher-level system journal that recorded the execution of the purge script itself. It was an act of supreme hubris. He never imagined anyone, least of all the CEO, would dig this deep into the machine's guts. A cold, hard anger, the likes of which Arthur hadn't felt in years, settled in his chest. The sector scan finished, it had found recoverable fragments of the shredded directory. He initiated the painstaking process of reconstruction. Slowly, like a shattered pot being glued back together, the files reappeared. Clara's meticulously documented research, her simulation parameters, and the final report with a timestamp of 4:12 a.m., which contained a sentence that made Arthur's blood freeze. The selection of the LTEC-7 amplifier, a component known to be susceptible to proton-induced phase noise, represents a critical procurement error and is the singular root cause of the Ariadne system failure. The evidence was absolute. It was a complete, documented timeline of discovery, theft, and a cover-up of catastrophic professional negligence. The betrayal was not just against Clara. It was a betrayal of Vance Aeronautics, of the DoD, of the very principles of engineering integrity he had built his company on. He picked up his desk phone. He didn't call security. He didn't call HR. He called General Miller. "General," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "get everyone back in the war room. The rabbit, it turns out, is a Trojan horse." The mood in the war room was one of self-congratulatory calm. The engineers and executives filed back in, their faces relaxed for the first time in weeks, expecting a final debrief from the general before breaking for a well-deserved celebration. Marcus Thorne was the center of it all, accepting congratulations with a magnanimous air, already planning how he would leverage this triumph into a promotion to Chief Technology Officer. Clara was not there. Arthur had sent his personal assistant to find her, asking her to wait in the quiet sanctuary of his office. He needed her away from the blast radius. When the heavy glass door hissed shut, Arthur remained standing at the head of the table, beside the dark, dormant, holographic display. His posture was rigid, his face carved from granite. The relaxed chatter in the room withered and died under his cold gaze. "Our celebration," Arthur began, his voice quiet but carrying the immense gravity of a collapsing star, "was premature. We have found the solution. But the story of how we found it reveals a cancer within this company far more dangerous than any signal drift." A tense, electric stillness fell. Marcus Thorne's smile faltered. He shifted in his seat, his confidence beginning to fray. "Marcus," Arthur said, his eyes locking on to his lead architect, "you told us you identified the hardware vulnerability through an advanced simulation. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right," Thorne affirmed, his voice a fraction less steady. "It was a complex analysis." "Was it?" Arthur interrupted. He pressed a button on his console. The holographic table blazed to life. It was not Thorne's presentation. It was the reconstructed file directory, Ariadne Root Cause Analysis, CE. And inside, displayed for all to see, was Clara's entire body of work, her research, her simulation logs, her final report, time-stamped 4:12 a.m. Gasps and sharp intakes of breath filled the room. The engineers stared, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. Thorne's face went corpse white. "This is a fabrication," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She must have backdated the files somehow. She's trying to steal my team's credit." "Is she?" Arthur countered, his voice a dangerous whisper. He brought up a new window on the display. It was the raw text of the system journal. He highlighted one line in damning red. "Then perhaps you can explain this entry to General Miller. It shows that at 4:28 a.m., your administrator account executed a military-grade shred command on this very directory, and then, 1 minute later, you attempted to purge the log of that command. You were sloppy, Marcus. You burned down the crime scene, but you left a signed confession in the ashes. The room was utterly silent. The evidence was a digital guillotine. Thorne stared at the screen, his mouth agape, his carefully constructed world dissolving into ruin. But the betrayal is deeper than that, Arthur continued, his voice resonating with cold fury. He brought up another document, the procurement order for the LTEC 7 amplifier, dated 2 years prior. At the bottom was a signature line. Dr. Marcus Thorne had approved the purchase with a handwritten note. Mil-spec version unnecessary. Standard model sufficient for mission parameters. Cost savings $8,500 per unit. You didn't just steal the credit for the solution, Marcus, Arthur said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. You stole it to cover up the fact that you were the problem. You created this crisis. You risked a multi-billion-dollar national security asset, this company, and the lives of the men and women who depend on our systems, all to save a pittance and earn a bonus. You let your team chase ghosts in the code for a month, knowing the whole time that the ghost was in your desk drawer. General Miller, his face a thundercloud of rage, rose slowly to his feet. Dr. Thorne, he said, his voice low and shaking with controlled fury, you have committed an act of fraud against the United States government. You are a disgrace. The greatest threat to this company isn't a solar flare, Arthur said, his gaze sweeping over his stunned team. It's the arrogance that allows a man to value his ego over the truth. It's a culture that dismisses a brilliant mind because it doesn't have the right diploma on the wall. He looked directly at Thorne, his eyes devoid of any pity. You are fired. Security will escort you from the building. I suspect you will be hearing from the Department of Justice before they get you to the parking lot. Utterly broken, Thorne pushed his chair back and stood. He didn't say a word. As he walked toward the door, a man stripped of his career, his reputation, and his freedom. He seemed to shrink, the empty suit of a man who had been hollowed out by his own deceit. Later, Arthur found Clara in his office. She was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. It's over, he said softly. She turned, her eyes weary but clear. He deleted everything. I thought. He tried, Arthur corrected her gently. But you of all people should know. The truth, like a signal, always leaves a trace, no matter how much noise someone tries to throw at it. He walked to stand beside her. I am sorry, Clara, for what he did, and for my own blindness. I was so desperate for a solution, I almost accepted the easy lie over the hard truth. That's a failure of leadership. My failure. I should have known he would steal it, she whispered. I should have been more careful. No, Arthur said, his voice firm. You should be able to do world-changing work without having to watch your back for wolves. It's my job to build a place where you can. A job I intend to do much better. He paused. The observatory grill is probably looking for a new waitress. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Coincidentally, he continued, Vance Aeronautics has an opening for a director of systemic integrity. I'm creating a new division, a team of skeptics and mavericks who will report only to me. Their job will be to challenge every assumption, to break our own systems, to look for the ghosts before they become monsters. It needs a leader who understands that the most dangerous flaws aren't in the code, they're in our thinking. The position is yours, Clara, if you want it. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. Director, a division of her own. I don't have a degree, she whispered, the old insecurity a stubborn ghost. Arthur smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. You have something far more valuable. You have the truth. You listened to the static when an army of experts was listening to their own echoes. They can't teach that at Caltech. He extended his hand. So, Clara Evans, will you help me teach my company how to listen? A slow smile spread across Clara's face, a brilliant, radiant dawn that chased away every last shadow of doubt. The waitress was gone. The imposter was gone. In her place stood a scientist, an engineer, a leader. Yes, she said, her voice firm and clear as she shook his hand. Yes, I will.